NACDL is the association of the nation's criminal defense bar.
Marc and I are going to speak about plea bargaining these cases. And like Natman said, if you're picking a jury, you've done something wrong. We don't want to try these cases. I know we come to these conferences and we learn how to try the cases, but we should be trying cases only being dragged there kicking and screaming. We have to deal them. We cannot play Russian roulette craps, get that, with our client's life. And so if you can deal it, deal it. I always think it sounds a little bit arrogant when a lawyer says, oh, I can win this. You know, I don't need to deal this. I don't want life without parole. I can deal this, or I can win this at trial. And I always think you better be very sure, right? Because it's not your life, it's your client's life. So goal number one, goal, responsibility, obligation on our part to deal the case. All right, so we'll talk about that for a little bit today. We're going to break it up. I'm going to talk about going and asking the prosecution not to seek the death penalty or asking them to let you plead the case out. So my portion of this presentation is going to be about approaching the prosecutor, and then Marc's portion of the presentation is going to be about convincing the client, convincing client's family, enforcing the plea bargain. So I'll cover the first part, he'll cover the second part. Going to see the prosecution, and when I first worked on a capital case, my first capital case was with David Wymore, who you just saw present. And I was a younger lawyer, and David would tell me, go ask the DA for a deal. I'm like, no, screw him, David. You know, X, Y, and Z, I'm not gonna go ask him for an offer. And go ask him for an offer. And he would not constantly, but just occasionally send me in to ask for an offer. And it, you know, in the 25 years of doing public defender work, I always found that the most humiliating, degrading, resentful work I ever had to do was to go ask a person not to kill my client. It's just disgusting. And I would, all right, I won't stray, but I hate it, right? We should not have to ask another person not to kill our client. That's just stupid. You know, we can argue over length of jail sentence and bond. That stuff makes sense to me. But asking someone not to go through the process of executing someone, to me, is insane and makes me crazy. So I've often asked, why? Why do we have to go do this? And part of the answer is because the ABA guidelines say that you have to. We have to try and deal these cases because it's the right thing to do, and because the American Bar Association tells you, go try and deal the case, and even if the prosecution says no, go back again another day and ask again, and keep asking. Through the Holmes case, the Aurora theater shooter case, I kept asking during the trial. You know, the prosecution would come over and say, hey, I was thinking about something. I go, giving us an offer? Like, I would just constantly stay on him, even throughout trial, because I don't want to take the risk that a jury will return a death sentence. So we have to talk to them, and we have to try and deal the case. Another reason why we do that is this is just a smattering of our clients in Colorado who we have had to go ask for life sentences from the prosecution and have gotten them. And these clients went to prison remain, of course, in prison today. But these are cases where we did not have to risk their lives with a jury. And they were the kind of cases where it certainly would have been a risk to go to trial. In talking with the prosecution, my theory is you have to treat them kind of like you would a juror. You cannot assume they know what mitigation is, even the definition of it, or the concept of it, or how it works. So when you go present mitigation or meet with the prosecution to ask for a life offer, I start with the basics and what mitigation is, what it is not. The prosecution always wants it to have a connection to the crime. It's like, yeah, so he was poor. Doesn't mean you get to go kill someone. And you have to, mitigation is not meant to excuse or defend or justify a crime. Mitigation is a reason to not execute them and explain what it is, what it isn't. The prosecution, I think, a lot of times feels like they need to be convinced that a life sentence is appropriate. Well, you haven't convinced me. And I've thought about that a lot when the prosecution says, you haven't convinced me, and my response has become, well, I don't need to convince you. I don't need to convince you that a life sentence is appropriate. I need to convince you that jurors or a single juror will think that a life sentence is appropriate. I'm not trying to convince you because, I don't say this is in parentheses, we all know you'll never believe a life sentence is appropriate. What I'm trying to present to you, prosecutor, is the information that I believe will convince jurors of a life sentence. So in your analysis, you should be analyzing, will the jury return a life sentence? And if yes, maybe you shouldn't be prosecuting this case as a capital case. And so I'm hoping that there's someone in the room with the prosecutor, because when we go in Colorado, it's getting bigger and bigger. It used to be like 1 or 2 prosecutors. Now it's a room of 30 people from their office who are hearing our mitigation presentations. And I thought, well, maybe that's good. Maybe there's at least one person in the room who, after I leave, will say to the prosecutor, I know we think this is bullshit, but don't you think jurors are going to be moved by that one thing she said? That's what I want the conversation to be after I'm gone, is I know we don't buy this, but maybe the jurors will. Don't you think? Like, why should we go spend the money and the time and put everyone through the trauma of this trial if she's going to get one juror? That's what I'm trying to, so I'm not trying to convince the actual district attorney personally. I'm hoping he or she will analyze it in terms of, can she get a juror? You have to, explain to the prosecution what mitigation is. Again, not an excuse. Information to help understand maybe how our client got there. Again, we're not saying it's okay to kill someone because of this mitigation, but this is the person's life story, and that's how they ended up here. And begin using, humanizing language with the prosecutor. It may or may not work for them, but it's certainly good practice for us in the event we do have to go in front of a jury. We have practiced this language and gotten comfortable humanizing our clients. Mitigating circumstances do not constitute a justification or defense, but in fairness and mercy may be considered extenuating or reducing the degree of moral culpability. And so when we are talking to the DA and later the jury, I just say mitigation is any reason any of you think would justify a life sentence. If you get an objection to that, if the prosecution pushes back on that, you just recite this language. Anything that reduces the moral culpability. So I get to present it to the jury and we'll see if they think that it's a reason for a life sentence. These are statutory mitigators that we have in Colorado: age, sort of these imperfect defenses. But frankly, I think where we get most traction is with the very last one, that I think most states have, any other evidence which may bear upon the client's moral culpability. All states, gotcha. And so, don't just stick to the statutory mitigators. It is anything. It is literally anything about your client's life that may. And I think we, as defense lawyers, we get caught up in, that just doesn't seem like very much. The fact that his piano teacher liked him, that just seems so insignificant when he has shot 12 people in a theater. How am I going to call his kindergarten teacher? Like, that just seems so ineffective, meaning, not persuasive for a life sentence. But I think what the jurors are looking for an entire picture of that person's life. And things like the piano teacher, the kindergarten teacher, parents, what they did, their positive things, their negative things, make them a person. And we never know what the juror is going to latch onto. If they have a kid who plays the piano, when we call the piano teacher, it seems insignificant, but to a juror, it might strike a chord, make them think of their own child, anything that sort of causes them to feel that this person is human, has worth, despite the awful, awful thing that they've probably done. And so we have to humanize our clients. Later today, I'll be doing a talk about mental illness as mitigation, and sort of the theme that I've picked for that is how the prosecution, in my opinion, in Colorado anyway, the prosecution is latched onto, whenever someone is mentally ill, they start spinning this theme of evil. And so we'll talk about that more later, but I think they do that because evil is hard to confront, right? Like, what the hell is it anyway? They just want them to be a bad monster that needs to be gotten rid of. We're not all like that, but this is just this evil thing that needs to be extinguished and go away. And I think our job becomes even harder to humanize them and to say that mental illness is not evil. And so we'll talk about that more later, but I think that's what we need to do with the prosecution and later with the jury. So we need to find a way to tell our client's whole story and humanize them. And our job in the Holmes case was to figure out and convey first, and 1,000 times after that, to the prosecution, and later to a jury, how this cute little boy ended up looking like that and killing 12 people. And the answer is not that he's evil, not that he's a monster, but we had to figure out, where in this progression did he become evil? Was he evil when he was born and just tricked us for the first two rows there? Was there somewhere along the way he became evil? What is evil, and at what point did he become that, right? Or is it that he was perfectly fine until schizophrenia struck, and then he was very, very sick? And so those were sort of the narratives that we were first combating with the prosecution, and when that didn't work, trying to explain and get jurors to understand it. Another client in Colorado, they like to take the picture, the one on your right, and say, there he is, there he's evil. But the picture on the left, he's just a normal looking guy. And again, I think we have to say, people don't just become evil, they don't just become monsters. Something happens I think usually a lot of times it's mental illness. And then because they don't want to look soft on crime or whatever, they won't believe our mental illness evidence, and they resort to, well, he's just a monster, look at him. As you guys know, themes of mitigation can be anything you can think of, anything that you think a juror will respond to. You don't have to have things that touch all the jurors. If it could possibly touch one juror, I think we present it. You just present it all. Hopefully someone will attach to something or more and return a life sentence. But that's all I know to do, right? Just put it all out there and hope that someone sitting in that jury box is not the kind of person who wants to execute a sick person. So present everything, how to do that persuasively. And let's talk about with the DA. When you're trying to present to the DA, you can do charts and graphs, and sometimes that is effective. I have really come to like the photos and the videos that we use, because I think you can describe something, but then when you show it, it takes on a lot more meaning, as we've always known. But I think we should continue with that, especially if your client's been in the military. Kathy McGuire, who's here, Kathy and I had a client who was in the military, came out, committed an awful murder, and the prosecution's going to want to ignore that client's military service, right? Because that is a positive, proud, good thing that person did. And so, we have to get pictures of them and present them, to show that they were good and courageous enough to defend our country in some capacity. And then that's totally different from evil, right? Evil people don't go. Courageous, good, proud, right? People go defend the country. And so if you have someone in the military, obviously that's a good angle. With the client that Kathy and I had, we found his jacket, his green Army jacket, and all the little pins on there. And I wasn't very familiar with those. I just saw those, and I have to confess I didn't know what they meant. But you can look up and find out what each one of those little pins are for, and then tell the prosecution that. This one is for humanitarian relief. This one is for courage. This one, and tell them all of these things, because, again, will a juror respond to that? When you read off those pins on your client's uniform, will a jury react to that? Will one juror up there say, all right, that's enough. I'm not giving this guy the death penalty if he did all of that for our country. I won't set him free, won't kick him back out onto the streets, but I'm not going to have him executed. And that's the question. Will this information convince a juror? It's one thing to say that your client was poor. I think it's another thing to show the DA what you're talking about. Our client grew up in this house in Mexico, and this was before it was okay for everyone in the country to say how much they hate people from Mexico. He came from Mexico to the United States. He, on a very bad day, took a tow rope, connected it to his car, and dragged a woman 1.3 miles up a road so bad they had to repave the road. And so if you're thinking there's no point to asking the DA for a life sentence in your case, yeah, that's what I was thinking too. 1.3 miles of repaved road, the crime scene was so bad. And so you're like, what can you possibly say to a district attorney in that case to try and get a life sentence? And so investigator and I went to Mexico, took these pictures of this just abject poverty. That's where his mom still lives today. Like, that's where he grew up, and that's still dirt floors, no plumbing, abject poverty. So it's one thing to tell them, it's another thing to show them. Another, in that same case where he grew up in Mexico, was at the bottom of a big volcano. It's an old extinct volcano, of course, but he grew up sort of in the valley of this volcano. And they had these gorgeous flower fields in this valley below the volcano. And he and other people who live there work in the flower fields when they're young, as long as they live there, they work in the flower fields, harvesting these beautiful orchids and things that then we buy at the florists, right? So they work at the bottom of this big volcano, and the water runoff is toxic because it's coming from an old volcano site down into the valley. And in the Valley of Beautiful Flowers, they spray all kinds of unregulated pesticides. And so you can explain this in words to the prosecution, or you can show them. We went to some municipal building to get some information, and they had this painting in the municipal building of the volcano. We're like, oh my God, that's perfect. So we took a picture of it to show, here's the volcano, here's the little field where he lived. Here are the animals, in the water that they used to drink and bathe in. So you have toxins from the volcano, you have toxins because animals are living in that water, and you have toxins from pesticides in that area. That's the water he drank and grew up on until he fled to the United States of America. And I think it helps if you just, I decide in that case, I'm not going to try and convince them about all the people who come over into the United States from Mexico, but just one. I just wanted the prosecution to understand why this one person left those conditions to come to our country to work at McDonald's, to send his money back to his family there. Just understand why one person did it, and don't execute him for that. And here's a picture of where they sell the pesticides. Right there, like in the market, you can just go in and buy some pesticides if you want. So you can do it that way. You can do, and our mitigation specialists and our investigators are great at doing the genograms and the social histories. They get color-coded and shapes, and they're great. I love our mitigation people just continue to evolve with what's available in these sort of programs to convey. But I think we need to convey sort of in a snapshot like this to the prosecution, here's how bad the family was. Here are all the people who suffered mental illness. Here are all the people who were abused. Here are all the people who were sexually abused. Here are all the people who suffered from drug addiction. And do it in sort of a snapshot visual way that hopefully will be effective to them. I think this is a list of all the people who had substance abuse issues. Well, if you don't think there were problems in that family after seeing that list, and I think things like this, again, convey to the prosecution, like, we're calling all these witnesses. These will all be mitigation witnesses that we will call, and we think that one juror will believe this client never had a chance given the problems that he had in his family. This I've used just as a quick way to demonstrate someone's IQ. Client was not intellectually disabled, but just a skosh above it, right? And so, you can say his IQ was 83 and hope that the prosecution understands what that means. Or you can do it this way. You're like, see the top of the bell curve? That's where normal people are. See the black line? That's where people are intellectually disabled. That red line, the skosh above, that's client. Just barely above an intellectually disabled person, so that when you're talking about bad decisions or things that client did, you can, because he's a skosh above, he's nowhere near where hopefully some of us are. And so that's just like a quick hit. Like, just a juror might look at that and say, oh my gosh, I'm not going to kill that person. I mean, they're almost intellectually disabled. Records, we get all these records, for every million pages you collect. This is the slide, you'll put together. You pick out the best information, the most compelling information from either client's records, and this happened to be our client's grandfather's records, and just pull things out, how the relatives suffered from mental illness, because I think it helps jurors believe client might be mentally ill if the people who came before them were mentally ill. I was sort of raised in the bad is good theory, so I'm always looking for the bad stuff. I'm looking for the abuse. I'm looking for the addiction. I'm looking for all the bad stuff, the poverty. Give me your trauma. Give me all, I want the bad stuff. And then people are like, Tammy, there's got to be a reason this person needs to live. I'm like, oh, you're right. So it can't just be bad. There's got to be good. There has to be people who love your client, reasons they should live. The parents, these are James Holmes's parents. I've often had conversations with other lawyers about, does it just seem manipulative to present these family pictures like this? Because the DAs just roll their eyes and scoff at me. They're like, you're just trying to be manipulative. No, what I'm trying to do is show you what I will present to a jury. And will a juror be touched by the parents who raised this baby, who became schizophrenic and killed a bunch of people? So when they say that you're trying to be manipulative, that's my response. Maybe that's how you see it, but you have to think, how will a juror see it? Here is a client who had 3 children, plus 2 children, plus a baby, all very quickly. Again, the conversation was, will they care? Will the prosecution care? Should we use this slide? Does it seem manipulative? Should we use it? That's our conversation. And that's when I said, I'm doing it, because that's his life. He does have those children. All those children should not grow up with the executed guy for a dad, right? And so when we presented this to the prosecution, the prosecutor said to me, and I quote, "Perhaps the children would be better off if he were dead." And I said, well, Mr. Topolnicki, I think you and I see the world differently. Moved on. Because I'm not going to fight with him over his view that killing all of those children's father would be a good thing. Agree to disagree. And just, maybe all the jurors will think the way you do. But if one doesn't, what, and again, this is a case we dealt, but those are the kind of comments that you might get. And I've just decided I'm not trying to convince them of anything. It's just, here's my information. Your job is to analyze, will a juror be affected by it? The guy from Mexico that I showed you his pictures, he had a little boy. He still has a little boy in Mexico. His name's Oswaldo. It's the cutest little thing. And we had an audio clip on here, and it doesn't work anymore. I wish I could play it to you. But what we had we had our client from the jail read a little kid's book and record it, and then we sent it to Oswaldo. And so we played just a little clip of him reading in Spanish this book, and I remember, ay, caramba, ay, and he was reading as if reading, because he was, to a child, and it was just so endearing. And again, I always think the DAs are just gonna roll their eyes and look at me like, seriously, Tammy? But we play this clip, and I see one of the DAs like wiping tears, and I'm thinking to myself, what are you doing? Like, are you playing a game with me? Like, what's your deal? I know you're not crying over this stuff, so like, what sort of game are you playing? But she was actually like touched, and she has sons, and I don't know, but I just remember thinking, oh my God, what are you doing? Why are you crying? Because I always present it to them assuming they will be touched by none of it, but we'll analyze how jurors will be. You have to come up with people who want your client to live. And we have to keep in mind, in Colorado, what we do, we started when we would go talk to the prosecution, we would want an agreement that everything done, we have a Rule 410, everything done during this presentation is done for the purposes of plea bargaining, so you cannot later use any of this evidence against us. We're exchanging this information for the purposes of plea bargaining, so you cannot use it in court or any way against us. They started putting together the confidentiality agreement, and if you see at the bottom, inadmissible in this case. And we're like, no, it's not inadmissible in the case. You can't use it against us. We can use it if we want to, but you can't use it. And so, beware if you have rules like that or you get a confidentiality agreement. Don't let them try and turn it on you or twist it around. This prosecutor was one who said, sometimes when you have a dog that is rabid, you just have to put it down. So that is, if that's the mentality you're dealing with, again, you have to just convince them. Again, I'm not trying to convince you. I understand your worldview. But there are going to be 12 jurors sitting there, and if they feel differently, it's your job to change my mind, it's just not enough. Strong holdout, that's not a resounding rejection of the death penalty. What to reveal or not to reveal, you have to, know your prosecutor. How much do you want to give them? As far as sourcing, you can say, we have a doctor who says, or you can tell them who the doctor is. And, I think those are all tactical decisions to make in deciding how much to give them. But I think we have to do a good faith effort to them, to give them enough information to do the right thing. But of course, I'm always mindful of how much is too much if you suspect that they're just getting your information to begin to prepare to, sabotage your mitigation. So that's hard, but we could have a whole nother lecture on that one. Prosecutor, quote, but not having the same brain that we have does not protect you from the ramification of your decisions. He made a decision to massacre, and he did. 12 dead from the community. Can anything outweigh that? I think we make our good faith effort with the prosecution. A lot of times it works, and a lot of times we deal the case, which is what we need to do. And I think only if you have no other choice, if you're dragged kicking and screaming, should we be in trial. But if we have to, we have to go to trial, but hopefully we don't. And I will turn it over to Marc to talk about, if you get that offer, you better have client ready to go, better have family ready to accept that that's what's going to happen, and make sure that it goes through. Thank you, guys.
So I like giving this presentation. I think this is kind of what we do as capital lawyers. Go to a lot of conferences. You hear about killer cross-examinations. That's the heading. How to do a killer cross-examination. Crushing the government with your closing argument. But very rarely, like you walk through City Hall, and people almost never will point to you and say, "Oh man, that's Marc Bookman. That guy pleads a case better than anybody." It's not something that we get a lot of positive feedback about, but it's the most important thing that we do. I think as Tammy has said, and anybody that's handled a lot of these capital cases knows. Wymore asked how many people have beaten the murder case at the preliminary hearing. Well, maybe witnesses don't show up or whatever, but the capital cases that most of us have had are not cases that we want to try. So this is really the most important thing that we do. And let me see if I can start to go through this. How many people have had this experience? These are quotes from various clients, and I bet you've had the same experience. Whatever's going to happen is going to happen. It's not my case, it's their case. Everybody works for the same company. Now, here's a little bit quick literary quiz. If you really want to hear about it, the first thing you'll probably want to know is where I was born and what my lousy childhood was like and how my parents were occupied and all before they had me and all that David Copperfield kind of crap. But I don't feel like going into it if you want to know the truth. All right, who said that? Holden Caulfield. Yeah, you've heard me speak before. I don't believe you knew it. All right. Anyway, so everybody's had that experience, right? That's the way I think our clients often think, and it's not surprising that they think that way. Here's another quote by Holden Caulfield. Lawyers are all right, I guess, but it doesn't appeal to me. They're all right if they go around saving innocent guys' lives all the time and like that, but you don't do that kind of stuff if you're a lawyer. So, we have to remember that when we're meeting our clients, this is what they're thinking, right? They're looking at us. We're not hired, although I guess this is NACDL. Maybe some of you are. In capital cases, we're generally not. And they're looking at us like we're paid by the same company that works for everybody else. So every once in a while, I'll get asked, what do you say to that client the first time you meet him to get him to plead? Well, okay. So the answer is nothing. Right? You don't say a word the first time you meet them to get them to plead. I had a client, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. I had a client, I'm going to return to this client later on. He said, I walked in, it was the first time I had met him. I had seen the probable cause affidavit. He was in big trouble. And the affidavit laid it out. And I met him. His name was Arnold Pearsall. He was one of the nicest guys you'd ever want to meet. He said, "Marc, I did this. I'm guilty. They caught me. The evidence is overwhelming, and I just want to get it over with. Let's try and get a life plea if you can, and we'll move on." Now, I had experience at that point. I had made this mistake a million times before, as many of you may have. A young Marc Bookman would have said, "Yeah, that sounds like a great idea. Let's do that." And then the silent language would be, I can get this file out of my room and move on to the next case. But I didn't say that. What I said was, listen, Arnold, too early for that. Let's not even think about a plea right now. I understand that the evidence is strong. I understand where you're coming from. We're going to have time to do this, but let's get the discovery. Let's go to the preliminary hearing. Let's hear what's going on. And then there's always going to be time to try to get a plea if necessary. And that's how I left him. But of course, I was feeling, reasonably positive about this meeting because I knew that the evidence was in fact overwhelming. And so I called my partner, who I handled all these cases with, a great lawyer named Carl Schwartz. And I called him, I said, I just met Arnold, and we're going to be fine with this case. He's already ready to plead. Don't worry about it. I didn't say we would plead him. I didn't make that mistake, because ultimately, when you say that too early, the client eventually just changes his mind and says, you sold me out. You didn't even look into the case, right? So I told them, don't worry. I didn't make that mistake. And then we went to a preliminary hearing, and the evidence was in fact overwhelming. And it was just, coming in with witness after witness. But then a police officer took the stand, and as is the wont of police officers, he couldn't just stick to the truth. He had to lie about something. And this lie was irrelevant to the case, but it irritated Arnold. He did not like it. And Arnold looked like Mr. T, if you remember Mr. T, a big, strong guy. Well, Arnold tipped over the defense table and came after the cop, practically strangled him, and about 20 sheriffs came pouring into the room. They pulled out Arnold, and he was like this, "You motherfucker, I'll kill you. I will kill you." And they pulled him out of the room. It was like a movie. Carl looked at me and said, "This is the guy we're not going to have any trouble with?" So I'll get back to Arnold later. Anyway, we say nothing the first time we meet our client, and that's, of course, what this presentation is about. It's about moving a client from where he normally would be, which is, I don't want to spend another minute in prison, to spending the rest of his natural life in prison. So, what do you do when the client says he didn't do it? You work with him. What do you do when the mother of the client says, "My son didn't do it"? That's when you shoot yourself in the head. That's when you are in trouble, right? You've got a problem then if the mother says that my son would never have done this, right? So there's ways we've got to deal with that. There's two types of parents, and parents. I don't say anything to the client. I have no rote speech at the beginning of a case. I don't think anybody in this room does, but I do have a semi-rote speech to parents when I meet them. And I try to meet them very early on, because I don't want that my son didn't do this to permeate the case and to pollute the case. The case will never be pled if that's what the mother or father is saying. So there's two types of parents. I love my son unconditionally. Whatever he decides, I'm going to support him 100%. That's like a talking point. It sounds good, right? But if there's any parents here, they know how stupid that is, right? I mean, you can't just support your son whatever he decides, right? If he decides to take a road trip to Atlantic City with his buddies when he's 16 and buy a couple of six-packs, I cannot support that. So that sounds good, but it's actually really stupid. And parents can understand it when you kind of lay it out to them, not that way. Here's the second type of parent, the one that's much better. I love my son unconditionally. I'm going to give him guidance and urge him to do what I think is right for him. I will assure him that I will love him regardless of his decision, but I want to emphasize that I love him no matter what he did, right? That's a parent that I can work with, right? That's a parent who understands there's a reason you're a parent. You've had a certain level of experience, and you have a certain distance from your son's experience. And so you can provide that kind of a guidance. That's what I want that's the role I want my parents to play. This is what Tammy was talking about when we kind of get everybody together. There are duties to negotiate pleas. And Tammy went through the guidelines, and probably throughout the weekend we're going to deal more with the guidelines. And I perceive the guidelines slightly different than everybody else. The guidelines are fantastic. I mean, they're written for us. They're written by us, basically, and they're terrific. I see them as weapons, right? And so I can't figure out where I'm going. Oh, here it is. Okay, so here's what a commissioner said in Salt Lake City recently. County Commissioner Harvey said he felt that defense attorney Newton was spending too much time trying to create relationships with his clients in prison. All the state wants to know is if the appropriate decision has been made in a conviction. That's a post-conviction case. I mean, nobody wants us to develop the relationships with our clients that we need to. And there's only one reason why. It's going to cost them money, right? They're going to have to pay for the trips that we're making to the prison. We're going to make constant trips to the prison they're going to have to pay for it. The state has to pay. That's the cost of doing business when you're seeking the death penalty. So the empire, they don't get what we do. And so the guidelines are weapons for us. Judge, for me to be effective, I have to do this. I have to develop a relationship with my client. And ultimately, I'm going to try and save you money by not going to a long capital trial and then a long capital appeal and everything that comes with it. I'm going to try and resolve this case. But to resolve it, I'm following the guidelines. I need to make these regular visits to my client. So there's all kinds of guidelines that help us with this. And there are weapons. There are the quivers in our bow to make sure that the courts know this is why I'm doing this. Hoffman versus Arave, I don't know how you pronounce that name. Someone out in the West will know. Basically saying that when you decide to take a case to trial, when you decide as the lawyer to take a case to trial, you have to factor in the chances of winning that case and the chances of your client getting a death penalty. That's something that's going to be reviewed later on. What stops clients from pleading? There's a lot of things that do, but what stops the client where there is overwhelming evidence? There's tons of evidence against them, and still they may not be processing it right, but let's assume they are processing it right. What's stopping them? Fear is one of the prominent things. Fear of what? Of the future, right? They're going to have to live the rest of their life. Oftentimes they're in a county jail, right? They don't really know what a state prison might offer them, but they're looking around. It's kind of a dangerous place, and they're fearful of living in the future in this population. They might have what we in Pennsylvania at least call a Z code. They might be living in a single cell, and they don't want to live with other people. They're fearful of other people. They're fearful that they're going to lose their family. They're not going to have any contact with anybody anymore. They don't know what a state prison is like oftentimes. Some of our clients do, but many of them don't. They can't kind of disregard their own self-image of what they think of themselves. How could my son would never do this, right? That's the mother's self-image. I could not have raised a child that would have done this, right? So we've got to overcome the mother's self-image. And then, of course, the client's self-image. What sort of person do you think I am? Do you think I would do something this horrible? And then, of course, mental illness. Is an incredibly common one, and this really irritating idea that seems to have spread in op-eds by well-meaning people that are filled with hate are not mentally ill. I don't know where we got that idea from, but we have a serious lack of understanding of mental illness. In this city, we had the guy shooting the 58 people on the street, and if you read the crawl at the bottom, it was making news for 24 straight hours. After 12 hours, there was a crawl that said, we're starting to get word that this person might have mental health problems. It took them 12 hours to figure that out. So we don't understand it. I'm not talking about us. I'm talking about the royal we that really we don't really get what mental illness does and can affect ourselves, our clients. And then, of course, lack of trust in lawyers. So we have to understand trauma. We cannot paint our clients into a corner. This is the primary reason that one of the first calls we make is to the family, right? We don't want them painting the client into the corner. The worst thing that can happen is the mother going to the client and saying, I know you didn't do this, son. No son of mine would ever do this. So we can shortcut that. We have to intercept the parents before that gets set in stone. We can't let the family paint our clients into the corner, and we can't replicate abusers. This is the late great Charlotte Holdman taught many of us this in our community. I was a kind of a slow learner to this. The fact that our clients are oftentimes mentally ill, and the fact that they can be incredibly annoying, those are overlapping Venn diagrams. It's not just one or the other, right? A lot of times when our clients are incredibly annoying, they're also mentally ill, almost all the time. And so if the client keeps saying to you, the discovery says I had the gun in my left hand, but this piece of paper says I had it in my right hand. I could not have done this crime. Well, it can be irritating after a while. And sometimes patience is not all of our best strong points. I get that. But we can't scream at the client, come on, it's in your right hand, for God's. That's not going to work, right? That's not a way to resolve the case. So we cannot replicate abusers when we talk about this. And then we've got to make acceptance of responsibility palatable. This is something I learned from Dana Cook, who I work with in Philadelphia. And basically, I used to be a trick attorney. I just wanted to trick my clients into pleading guilty. Just get it up. It's Tuesday. You got to plead. Everybody comes into the courtroom has to plead guilty on Tuesday. Just whatever I had to say, get the plea down and move it along. But the truth is that the more our clients are able to accept responsibility, the more they're understanding themselves and their backgrounds, the more likely it is that they're going to be able to stand up and actually take the plea. So we've got to work on acceptance of responsibility, and then we've got to look at all the alternatives that we have. No contest pleas, Alford pleas. These are all options that we can pursue to take the burden off of our clients when they are in fact burdened. No client takes a deal because his lawyer tells him to take a deal. That never happens. Unless you're a better lawyer than anybody I know, it doesn't happen. Clients take deals because people they trust tell them to take the deal, right? That's how it works with us, and that's how it works with them. It's how it works with everybody. You have a serious decision to make. Who do you turn to? You turn to somebody who you've come to trust, somebody who you've seen, over time, who's in your corner. And you know that when they're giving you advice, it's advice that you can take to the bank. They care about you. They don't have an ulterior motive. So can lawyers become trusted? Sure. Lawyers become trusted all the time. We visit the client, as much as we can. We do the investigation no matter how dumb it is. We've all been asked to do kind of dumb investigations, for lack of a better word. You got to do those investigations because then you can come back and say, we did this. We looked into it. Here's what we found. At midnight, Bill Smith did not show up at the corner. Whatever the investigation was, we've got to be able to do that and say that it didn't work out. This is a hard one for me. Got to listen more than you talk. We can become better listeners. None of us in this room, I'm guessing, at least not the lawyers, are particularly great listeners. Mitigators more so, I think. We can become better listeners, and it's really important to, how we, and I'm talking about myself, when I hear somebody say something, I just want to jump in. Get my word in. I want to say what's on my mind. But clients are the same way. They got a lot to say, and we've got to give them the opportunity to say it, to actually hear them. Got to share discovery with the client. This is a big one for me. I think it's insane expecting a client to plead guilty when he hasn't really absorbed the discovery, the evidence against him. And there are reasonable minds can differ about this, but I think we've got to show it to the client. Got to litigate motions. I'm going to talk about this later today, litigation, and David Wymore talked about it a lot this morning. You got to let the client know that things are happening for him. It's the reason I didn't tell Arnold Pearsall, don't worry, we're pleading your case before I saw any of the discovery, right? But we got to be able to litigate motions and have the client see them, and just keep seeing the client more and more. Who decides whether someone's going to plead? Well, of course, the client decides. The client decides, and the client only decides. But in reality, who decides? We decide, right? If we are not sure that the case should be resolved by plea, then of course the client is not going to decide to plead. We have to decide, and everybody on the team has to be in agreement. This is what Tammy was, avoid trial lawyer syndrome. Just ask your significant other or somebody in your family if the case sounds like a good case. Because if you think it's a good case, you're going to get an awakening by somebody else who said, what? He did that? Okay. So, most of these cases, Don't fall into some trial lawyer syndrome. Yes, you're the best lawyer in the world. No, you're not winning this case. And then there's Stitt versus United States, a very important case. Two lawyers go up to see the client. One lawyer says, I think you got to take life without parole. The other one says, I don't know. I think we can beat this case. Well, guess who the client's going to like, right? Guess who the client's going to listen to? These cases are very, very arranged for negotiation. We have to make sure that as a team, we're all in agreement about this. Everybody's got to agree. I'm gonna skip this slide because we're running a little late. Three very important factors in achieving the goal of resolution: understanding your client's past mitigation, creating present mitigation for the client, and imagining future mitigation. So I'm going to blow through this because we have a lot of sessions on it. You got to know who you're talking to. When you is your client low? Our clients mask all the time, right? So low functioning clients can often act like high functioning clients. But if we don't know they're low functioning, then we're not going to be able to communicate with them in the way we need to. If we don't know their trauma history, then we are in danger of triggering trauma that's going to stop a plea. We've got to do the full workup. Before you ever get anywhere near plea resolution, you've got to know what your client is dealing with in his or her background. And then, of course, we've got to know the power base of the client. Usually it is the mother or the father, not always. I had a client once who didn't care a bit about his family, but he loved Mumia Abu Jamal, who was kind of an iconic death row revolutionary figure in Pennsylvania. Well, we went and got a letter from Mumia saying, don't be an idiot. Take this deal. I looked at, your lawyers talked to me about this case. You're not doing anybody any favors by going to death row with me. So you got to know the power base of the client when you're trying to talk. And of course, you've got to persuade the power base before you are going to get anywhere near persuading the client. So we're running late here. I'm going to really kind of blow through this quickly. Creating present mitigation is important. Our clients' families are not always great about seeing the client, right? They have their own difficulties to work their way through. We've got to make it possible for them to visit the client. We've got to pick up the family, get them there, make sure they got the trans pass, whatever it is, get money from the courts to have them visit if necessary. But there's got to be that kind of contact, or else the client is lost. He's abandoned. He's in his cell alone. We try to get him jobs, working on the pod, whatever it is, getting him out of the cell to realize that there's a future there. And that's what imagining future mitigation is all about. That life in prison really is a life. A lot of us have taken to bringing in great outsiders. Wilbert Rideau is a terrific resource. And I think a lot of locales have people that have been there before and can talk to clients about the future they can create, in life in prison. We had a client that called his children every day from the prison. He was raising his kids in prison. So it can be done. And our clients have to understand that their families will continue to support them and that they will continue to be important to the family. So this is something that we can do when we're trying to get pleas down. They've got to be convinced they're not going to be abandoned and they're going to be important to their family as it continues. When do we talk deal? This is kind of like my social life. It's when the mood is correct. It's the investigation is almost complete. Everything the client has wanted is done. The team is in full agreement. And the conversation is very, very, very planned. So, tell two quick stories and then I'll be finished. The team expands. It never contracts. And you never know who was on your team. You never know, who is going to make the difference. We try to choreograph this. You don't just send somebody up to the prison and then they come back and say, hey, I talked about a life plea to Arnold. Here's what he thinks. That's a team that's not working properly. Like the decision to when to broach the topic of resolution is very, very coordinated by the team. Everybody knows about it. Who's the best person to broach this the first time? Who's the best person to follow up? What was the reactions? It's all quite choreographed. Having said that, I will tell a very quick story about a guy who a Honduran national. We had his family come in for 1 week. Nobody spoke English. So the family, the mother and the sister, went and saw the client every day in the prison. And every night we would entertain the family. We'd have hootenannies at my house and picnics, and they would wander around. And our secretaries were Spanish speaking, so they went around with the family. And so for a week we did this. They went, and they only had a week, and then they were heading back to Honduras. We knew we had to plead the case in that week. That was the window. Once the family left, our chances were leaving with them. So for a week they went up and saw the client, and every night we entertained the family through our secretaries in various different ways. Well, the day comes for the plea, and the prosecutor, a lovely woman, decided that a guilty plea, a no contest plea, which we had agreed on, was not satisfactory. Had to be a guilty plea. Now, there's no legal difference between those two things. Doesn't matter. She just had to be an asshole, and that's the way it is. So the client would not plead guilty. It was very important for him to say he's not contesting the facts. He would not plead guilty. Well, this is the last day. Family is leaving town. So everybody's in the booth trying to persuade him. And the client is crying. The mother's crying. The sister's crying. Everybody is pleading with each other, but the client won't budge. And so one of my secretaries, who'd been following us around for a week, now part of the team, comes barging into the room and screams at the client, "You're not going to treat your mother and your sister this way. You're taking the deal." Well, sure enough, he took the deal. My secretary got that deal down. I swear that's true. I want to just finish up with, all right, case can be resolved at any time. We've resolved it at we've resolved cases at all of these times. But I want to get to I've already talked about some of this. I want to just get to the very end because we're a tiny bit late. So I told you about the Arnold Pearsall story. He got dragged out of the courtroom. My partner looks at me and says, "This is the guy who's not going to be any problem." But in fact, he proved not to be any problem. And here's a letter he wrote. Don't read ahead if you don't mind. And you'll see in one page, he captures everything that I've been talking about. Let me just see if I can bring it up. Sorry, I had to skip all this. Here, this is a letter to the mitigator in the case, Erin Fennell. Ms. Erin, hi, how are you doing? Tell Carl and Marc I said hello, and I'll never ever forget you guys for saving my life. And I ask God for forgiveness every day because I took someone's life. I'm doing real good. I don't stress that much because I know I've done wrong and I have to pay for it like a man. My family are doing well also. They all write, visit, and help me with money. Thanks for the cards on my birthday and Christmas. I hope to hear from you guys in the future. You all are some cool white people. Take care, Arnold. So I'm still friendly with Arnold to this day, years later, but that's the end of the presentation. So thank you.